Back in November, Monster Hunter Wilds had an open beta test, finally giving me the chance at some hands-on experience with the upcoming release. To be upfront about it, I have plenty of issues with the beta, but I did enjoy it regardless. Monster Hunter, as it stands, has been my favorite series since playing Freedom Unite with my brother way back in 2009. The previous couple of releases have been mixed bags of good and bad for me, except for Monster Hunter Rise, which has been mostly just bad. Wilds seems like will at least be a good game. Whether it'll be a good Monster Hunter game or not, we will have to wait and see for the full release. So, let's actually talk about the Wilds beta. Obviously, the first thing you do when starting a Monster Hunter game is to make a character. I typically spend 1 to 3 hours at this step of a game if it has a good character creator. I have been burnt in the past though by demos saying your character settings will carry over to the full release, so I skipped this and picked a preset for use in the demo. We'll come back to this in the full release. After character creation, we're thrown into a long interactive cutscene, and it's a cool opening for the game in general. Capcom could have easily just made this the typical cutscene with 0 player input, having the player actually play the game instead of watching with a 1,000-yard stare as the game does cool things without you is always a plus in my book. It could be a bit better with some tweaks though, like having the player gain control while on the ship and letting you jump on the Sacred yourself. Once free of the rails that bound me to the cutscene, I spent some time going through settings, which we'll come back to later. Afterwards, instead of immediately going to terrorize the wildlife, I spent time getting a feel for the game. Contrary to what I expected from watching the trailers, the player character itself is very well animated. It also feels like there's some weight and heft to the player, which is a stark contrast from Rise, thankfully more in line with World. Personally, I'd prefer if the new games were as heavy as the old games and a bit slower paced, but this is still nice. Following up how the player movement feels, naturally, it's time to talk about the weapons. This is where some of the negative starts to pop up. I gave the majority of weapons a try during the beta. I will say that the Greatsword and Hammer both feel great. If you have played a lot of these two weapons in the previous games and intend to play them in Wilds, you'll have a pretty easy time adjusting to the new game, regardless of the minor changes that these weapons got. The other weapons, though, they feel foreign, for a lack of a better term. This is not to say they feel bad, but they have had enough changes to the point where they don't feel like the same weapons from the past 5 generations of games. Basically, they're the same, but different in ways that are noticeable. However, if you've played Rise, you might recall the Hunting Horn was basically replaced by a Skinwalker pretending to be the Hunting Horn. That's been walked back some, and the Horn is more in line with World now. I bring this up because Wild seems to be doing the same thing with the Insect Glaive. Picking up the Insect Glaive in this beta immediately felt awful. And not just because of the garbage low-ranked insects you always start with. It feels slow, even with the triple buffs. They removed several attacks, including the ineffective but fun aerial bouncing attack. Although they've added new moves to compensate, the normal melee attacks that were added are charge attacks, meaning you either stop attacking entirely the target, or you awkwardly hold circle while doing triangle combos until the charge is finished. Doing the charge attack combo strings also expends your extract buffs. It feels like the entire playstyle of the weapon has been shifted in such an extreme way that it may as well be called something else. While on topic of weird design choices for weapons, Charge Blade's file system seems to have been giving a massive change, although I didn't play enough to figure out the details of it. Another change is the ability to access super amped elemental discharges. It's been nerfed. You can no longer use SAEDs whenever you want. Instead, you're forced to spam through some other attacks to access the SAED. The Charge Blade and Insect Glaive were both added in Monster Hunter 4, and have both received constant nerfs every game since, be it in the form of damage output, mechanics, or moveset changes. It honestly feels like Capcom might have something against these weapons in particular. Don't worry though. Capcom's Golden Child, the Longsword, has of course been giving even more in this game, being a whole new base moveset when you have Red Spirit Gauge. And Helm Splitter getting a combo extender. Capcom has also introduced a perfect block mechanic to weapons with the ability to guard, and they've basically reintroduced Adept Dodge from Monster Hunter Generations to dual blades and bows, both of which feel like things that could have been in the series for a long time, and can potentially go far as a form of skill expression for players to enjoy. However, both seem to be very lenient with how easy they are to trigger. I hope they dial them back some in the full release, as at the moment, they seem too easy to pull off. Perfect blocks also seem to contribute to some kind of clash system with monsters as well, but I do not have a good grasp on the mechanic at this moment. Now, it's time for some trivia. What do the Greatsword, Hammer, Switch Axe, and Charge Blade all have in common? If you answered the ability to throw other players, you would be wrong. That is to say, you would be wrong if we're talking about this beta, where for some unknown reason, they've randomly taken away the ability to throw players from the Greatsword, Switch Axe, and the Charge Blade. I was under the impression that this was a bug, and reported it as such in the survey tied to this beta. However, I'm now revising the script again as of December 4th, where apparently, according to a Famitsu article, it has come to light that the Hammer's ability to throw players is the bug, rather than the other three weapons losing the ability to do so. This is an objectively awful choice, as this removes several elements from cooperative play, examples being throwing paralyzed teammates to save them, and throwing teammates for mount attacks. Saving the two new universal weapon mechanics for the end of this section, we have the new focus mode. I got the hang of it pretty quick, and I will say I do not like it. My opinion may change with the full release, and more time with it, but as it stands, it feels way too strong. It is basically impossible to miss an attack unless the monster moves completely out of your effective range. I can see monsters jumping or running really far away from you while in combat being made much more common due to this. It also looks really stupid being able to basically spin in place with any attack. It reminds me of rotating a placeable object in the game, or spinning a trophy in Smash Bros. When looking at it. On the flip side though, we have the new wound mechanic, which is tied to the focus mode. This is something I actually like. Attacking a single spot on a monster repeatedly causes weak spots to appear, which you can then break through with a special attack to wound the monster. This feels very good to do. Again, it's something that feels like it could have already been in the series, and just wasn't there. I do not like how the weak spots glow though. It feels very video gaming, and I have had issues with this kind of thing since Hyper Monsters back in Monster Hunter Generations. It is also infinitely better to deal with compared to the awful Clutch Claw mechanics that were added to World by Iceborne. The Clutch Claw was awful, and made the great game that was World objectively worse with its addition. I'm sure nobody will disagree with that statement. It's time we talk about the settings. It's mostly bad, honestly. There's a lot that I would say is wrong here, or settings that are just flat out missing that should be here. Let us start with the few good things. You can change the Palico from speaking back to just cat noises, which should be the default, but it's not. There are also some minor settings to change the controls and the way the game plays to be more like the PS2 games, Monster Hunter, and Monster Hunter DOS, which I think is great, but sadly, there's no option for stick control attacking. You can also, once again, turn off damage numbers. Having them off should be the default, but at least you can turn them off. There's an option to turn blood on in Wilds, unlike in World. Again, showing blood should probably be the default setting here. I know that there were people that were worried about another Monster Hunter game without blood. Lastly, we have a returning feature of the weapon combos in the top right corner. A very nice HUD setting for beginners, or people picking up a new weapon, with the option of disabling it if you want. This setting is also the only default set by the devs that I agree with so far. From here on out, there's not much good that I can say about the beta. There are a lot of design choices coming up that I find to be disappointing, bad, or even offensive to the senses. The option to have the game's spoken language be the Monster Hunter language is not in the beta, and, according to the Famitsu article mentioned earlier, will not be in the full release. It's extremely disappointing to have the language of the world not be an option, especially when both Rise and World had it. If I was not going to be streaming the game, I would want to use the Monster Hunter language instead of English. The player character is voiced, which I would be fine with if, like in Rise, you could mute your character. This game has a character creator. Plenty of people are going to put themselves in the game, and hearing somebody else's voice come out of your mouth is extremely jarring. There's a setting to reduce the number of tutorials that pop up, but they cannot be completely disabled, which sucks. There's also a setting labeled, and I quote, repeat tutorials, end quote, with the option of do not repeat. You would think that this would prevent tutorials you have seen from popping up multiple times, except that setting flat out tells you that tutorials you have seen before will still pop up regardless of the setting. Why does this setting even exist then? Because fuck you, that's why I suppose. The game also backseats you, and there is no way to disable it. So not only will you be harassed by these tutorials, the NPCs, your Palico, and even your player character will be backseating you. No options to disable any of it, and I cannot wait to be annoyed non-stop again by the game, just like in Rise. This is not only shit tier design, but genuinely offensive to the senses. I feel like a deaf person would have a better experience where this is concerned, at least if it's anything like the NPCs in Rise. Then we have the HUD. The HUD animations are ugly, distracting, and they cannot be disabled. with the massive flashing red warning animation being the worst of them. Not only is it unnecessary, as you should be learning the monster's attack patterns, but it's also incredibly distracting. It got myself and other people I know killed because it would flash and we would look away from the monster due to it. Eyes are naturally drawn to movement in your peripheral vision, and a bright red, flashing, erratically moving warning is going to catch your eye most of the time. I cannot even say this is something that should be an option to disable. I would say something like this has no place in games, period. On top of the HUD looking ugly, the various HUD elements are weirdly spaced apart, with things all over the screen instead of condensing them to take up less screen space. You can resize the HUD, but you cannot move where things are on it. So, bad placement just adds to how ugly the overall HUD is. Then we have the quest timer randomly being moved to the right side of the screen instead of the top left corner. You know, where it belongs, and where it's been since Monster Hunter's release. The final HUD element I want to call attention to are the pop-ups on the right-hand side. On a personal level, I do not like things like this, but they are not something I feel too strongly about normally. The only reason I mention it is because they are stretched to about a fourth the width of the screen. I would say these pop-ups are twice the size that they functionally need to be. I doubt there will be anything in the full release that needs the size of a pop-up. I do not believe the size of these notifications can be changed, nor can you disable them. Most of the user interface and menus are pretty awful as well. They've randomly decided to move away from how the menus and UIs were laid out for 20 years. A classic case of devs deciding they need to reinvent the wheel and just making something worse as a result. Now we have a convoluted mess that's more difficult to get through on almost every level compared to the old generations of games, or even the 5th gen games for that matter. The remaining things I want to touch upon are not broad enough to have sections dedicated to them, so I've saved them for the end here, starting with the multiplayer, a big aspect of the series. And I'm not even going to bother talking about how the multiplayer is set up. Not even in my wildest, sleep-deprived fever dreams could I figure out the awful lines of reasoning that went into everything the multiplayer system seems to be. I can only assume such a terrible system is the result of slapping together something to use for the demos and betas. Here's to hoping it'll be nothing like this in the full game. Moving on to something that I do think is worth talking about. Did you know that the Monster Hunter series are RPGs? No? Well, I'm not surprised, as this series has pretty much never been talked about for the RPG aspects. The one I would point out for having handled the RPG elements the best so far is Monster Hunter 4. Based off the beta though, it seems like Capcom is making a push for the RPG aspects to be more relevant in Wilds. And oh god, I hope the NPC interaction in the beta is not what they're going with in the full game. The jarring and off-putting jump cuts that swap constantly between whoever's talking has to be one of the worst ways I can imagine dealing with dialogue in a game. For some reason, they've also decided that whenever the player character is speaking, they need a jump cut to your face, so you can know that you are the one talking now. You know, in case you're incapable of following the flow of a conversation at all. Before anybody brings it up, I know that this style of camera work is used in beloved games and popular games, like The Witcher 3 and Fallout 4. In fact, in the Witcher collaboration for Monster Hunter Wilds, you can even see it there. There's no sugarcoating this. It sucks ass in those games as well. There is something I expect not many people would talk about though. That would be how gathering works in this game. To be upfront, I don't like it, but I have to accept that there are many things that will never go back to how the old games did it. That is a topic for another day though. So, taking as objective of an approach as I can with this, it's still bad. So gathering in this game seems like it will primarily be done by not going anywhere near what you're picking up. You just fire your slinger, and it auto-collects everything for you. Herbs? Mine. Bugs? Mine. The vocal cords of that still living bat? That's right. Also mine. Bone piles, though, no. You better actually go and collect those the old-fashioned way, which is extremely odd when it seems like literally everything else can be gathered automatically by the slinger. The only other overworld material that cannot be collected is ore. Kind of. You or your Palico have to break the mining nodes before you can slinger it, but the slinger only collects one drop at a time, instead of all of it. Extreme inconsistency like this is just bad. Before anybody tries to mention fish not being gathered via the slinger, fishing is not gathering. Fishing is a minigame that you can, again, skip by throwing a net into the water. Speaking of mining nodes though, the animation is abysmal. Almost. Not quite, but almost. Offensive to my senses. Pulling out this tiny joke of a pickaxe, chipping at it and collecting what sounds like glass. It's kind of wild, honestly, how out of place this feels. It would have been much better if these were geodes that were sealed, instead of just open and exposed to crystals. It would explain why you cannot just slinger these to collect them. The animation could easily be fixed by having the hunter or palico pull out a real pickaxe, like in every other monster in the game, and having them smash the node open, where you would then crouch down and collect the materials. Obviously replacing sound with glass with the smashing clattering of rocks for ore, and I'm unsure of how to explain the sound of gathering crystals, but they do not typically sound like cleaning up pieces of a broken window. In the end, when all is said and done, I'm still looking forward to playing Wilds on release. The beta was just an incredibly small glimpse at what the game might be, and seems to be a pretty old build at that. There's a good chance that the devs will improve things before the full release, which will hopefully be a pleasant surprise for me. I've been actively avoiding any info on World since a bit before the beta went public. I don't intend on looking at anything for this game until the full release, unless another beta is given to us, which is also why I haven't personally read the Famitsu article that I mentioned previously. Also, I can't read Japanese. The info I know from it was brought to my attention by my friend Sozu, who read some of the early versions of this script, and he thought that I should know about. The article will be linked below as well for anybody who wants to read that for themselves. I've been streaming for a couple of years now, and the whole time I wanted to get into making review videos. Pretty much everything related to this project has been a first for me, from writing and reading a script to image and video editing, though it's been one hell of a trip working through this for the past month or so. At this point, it's been almost 2. Shout out to my friends, Blazelord, Maelstrom, and Sozu, who helped me out and provided feedback on this project. Also, Sozu's been harassing me saying that I need to shill in this video. Yes, I'm throwing him under the bus on this one. So, subscribe if you liked the video. I do plan on making more. I would actually like to hear anybody's thoughts in the comments below. My Discord, stream, and VODs channels will be linked in the description below. Alright, goodbye, and good luck.